Debate or dispute can be important parts of archaeology, just like for any discipline. In this video, I will share some of my experience with these issues. I will focus on researching the earliest site layers in the Mariana Islands that happened to be the oldest known sites in the remote Pacific Oceanic region. The key points here can be instructive about how to manage a debate or dispute in general. In my view, a debate involves subjective issues that are open to differences of opinion or interpretation. The objective facts and points of evidence are not debatable. A dispute could involve any kind of disagreement, potentially including a disagreement about whether or not the facts, as presented, are accurate or reliable. In archaeology, the strongest argument always is based as closely as possible on the material facts, such as knowing the location of a site, the measured time period of a site layer, or the forms and numbers of different artifact categories. In my published work, I like to present all of the factual data sets about a site investigation, and then I do not need to rely on the interpretive inferences. In this way, the evidence presents itself in its own terms, the approach avoids debates about subjective aspects of opinions or interpretations, and simultaneously, the factual emphasis avoids disputes about those facts. Several of my published works provided the substantive evidence about the earliest site layers in the Mariana Islands. The radiocarbon dating results showed that these layers represented the first time when people ever lived in the remote distant islands of Pacific Oceania, at least as early as 1500 BC. The supporting documentation included several dozens of radiocarbon dates from multiple sites of separate islands of the Marianas, along with attention to the site layers and stratigraphy, the raw materials that were being dated, and the calibration curves and corrections for the different dated materials. The results pointed to an initial cultural habitation at least as early as 1500 BC. The factual basis of earliest Mariana sites at 1500 BC can allow people to proceed with various subjective interpretations about what those facts could imply. For instance, did some of the people living in the Mariana Islands at this early time period voyage even farther across the Pacific Ocean to inhabit other places? In my published work, I consistently have outlined how people from the Marianas potentially may have contributed to these farther voyages, but they could not have been the only people involved. The next inhabited areas in the Pacific, associated with lapita pottery well after 1500 BC, contained evidence of domesticated pigs, dogs, and chickens that could not have come from the Mariana Islands, where no such domesticated animals had existed. These elements must have come from somewhere else, and the only known realistic possibility at this time range was in island Southeast Asia. This same interpretation applied when looking at the ancient DNA evidence from the Marianas and other regions, specifically proposing that the ancient Mariana Islanders may have contributed only partially, if at all, to the founding populations in the lapita pottery region a few hundreds of years later. A few colleagues have published about how they disagreed with my interpretation, yet they actually did agree with my interpretation. The ploy here was to claim that I had proposed something entirely different from what I actually wrote in text and illustrated graphically. The critics in this case fabricated a debate by claiming that I had proposed that the ancient Mariana Islanders were the sole source population of all other communities in the region. In this situation, I did not need to engage in a debate because nothing really was being debated. Most importantly, people always can look at the original publication record. An extreme example of a fabricated debate is when people disregard the available facts and instead propose their own alternative facts. Despite the abundant evidence published about earliest Mariana settlement around 1500 BC or perhaps earlier, a few people continue to propose later Mariana settlement around 1200 BC, or perhaps even later. Simply by asserting these false claims in enough public view, the perpetrators can create the appearance of a debate or a dispute. This approach relies on presenting false information or selectively presenting incomplete information. Typically, this approach starts by sharing the alternative facts or opinions through personal email communication, online media posting, or other non-peer-reviewed venues as a way to build support without the peer review process and without alerting the target of the criticism. one group of critics published about how one excavation in one portion of one site at Inhabiting in the Mariana Islands was unable to find material with radiocarbon dating as old as I had found in my earlier excavation. In fact, the single deepest and oldest radiocarbon dating sample in this other excavation did confirm the same earliest site dating. I later returned to the site of Inhabiting for yet another excavation and verified the early dating just prior to 1500 BC. Furthermore, I obtained the dating material from hearth features and other secure contexts, targeting short-lived charcoal specimens paired with shellfish food remains to be extra confident about the radiocarbon dating calibrations and corrections. This procedure allows for calculating what we call the delta R for the marine reservoir correction, and the results all were consistent with each other and therefore reliable. Even more, I followed the same procedures at my other excavations of different sites in separate islands of the Marianas, achieving the same results again, and therefore leaving no doubt whatsoever about the accuracy and reliability of the radiocarbon dating. I did not bother to engage in a back-and-forth banter with my critics. Rather, I published the primary material evidence, and I allowed for the evidence to speak for itself. Next, my critics proposed that something must be wrong with the radiocarbon dating of the shellfish midden remains in particular. They proposed that a hard water effect may have contaminated the shells with an inbuilt older age, thereby making the radiocarbon measurements of these shells appear to be older than they actually should be. This hypothesis is possible, yet I already had addressed it by obtaining radiocarbon dates for multiple pieces of short-lived charcoal specimens paired directly with the marine shells inside the same hearth features or other secure contexts, repeated in multiple sites of 3 separate islands, all producing the same results. In this case, if the hypothetical hard water effect or any other age-altering effect were true, then I already had accounted for the specific marine reservoir correction, or delta R, in my published work that already had been available prior to the attempted criticism. Additional critics looked at the total database of radiocarbon dates from the Mariana Islands, and they proposed that the oldest dating was closer to 1200 BC instead of what the evidence really indicated at 1500 BC. Notably, these particular critics never worked at any of the early Mariana sites, nor were they involved in the projects in any manner. Even more awkwardly, I already had published a complete compendium of all of the radiocarbon dates and all of the details that conceivably could have influenced how to interpret the results. The second review of the same radiocarbon dating database was of course unnecessary, and the only difference was in proposing a set of alternative facts that were contradicted by the original database that already had been published. The alternative facts in this case relied on 2 false premises. First, several of the earliest radiocarbon dates were excluded from the analysis, claiming incorrectly that they were from non-cultural contexts, or sometimes not giving any reason for excluding them. Second, the critics claimed that some of these separate stratigraphic layers should be combined together into singular units, contrary to the original published documentation, and then they referred only to the uppermost and most recent layers dated hundreds of years later than the initial habitation layers. Again, I did not engage with these critics about discussing the real facts versus the alternative facts. Instead, I continued to publish more of my work and to share the objective primary datasets from my next excavations. I consider these attempted criticisms as bad faith counter-narratives similar to propaganda, intended to influence people away from the actual evidence. When I was an editor of different peer-reviewed journals and books, I learned how to identify these bad faith arguments simply by using basic skills in critical thinking and logical reasoning. Often, all I needed to do was to read the source material, and then the true facts emerged naturally. As an editor, I have seen bad faith arguments not only by the authors of prospective manuscripts, but also by the peer reviewers of manuscripts. In academic publishing, a peer reviewer can assert a tremendous influence about whether or not an editor will accept a manuscript for publication. A supportive reviewer could overlook deficiencies, inaccuracies, and bad faith arguments that otherwise would be grounds for rejecting a manuscript. Likewise, a hostile reviewer could prompt a rejection of a manuscript on the basis of a review that asserts its own false claims and bad faith arguments. Unfortunately, some academic editors and publishers do not exercise these same critical thinking skills that I do. Many of them rely heavily or even entirely on the peer reviewers who may not be providing accurate information. These editors can be fooled into thinking that a bad faith counter-narrative is indeed a legitimate criticism, perpetrated either by the author of a manuscript or by the peer reviewers. Even worse, much of the effort to create a bad faith counter-narrative happens behind the scenes in personal conversations, email communications, social media posts, and conference presentations that all are not peer-reviewed. Additionally, these actions occur without the target of the critique knowing about them until maybe later, or maybe never, and therefore the criticism can proceed without any resistance. Typically, a bad faith counter-narrative starts in this fashion, much like teenagers gossiping about someone who they dislike behind the person's back, as a way to create the appearance of a controversy without allowing the target of the gossip to present any kind of defense. These kinds of unprofessional behaviors have allowed the criticisms of my work, and I am not alone in this regard. One of the most famous examples of this treatment in world archaeology has been for the dating of the earliest archaeological site layers in the American continents. For several decades, the earliest confident dating was at least 14,000 years old. Yet a few influential individuals in academic archaeology created a counter-narrative of doubting these dates and instead preferring a later dated context around 12,000 years ago. Only within the last few years has the academic community at large started to move toward accepting the dating at 14,000 years old and possibly older. The underlying problem here is the tendency among academics to accept two sides of an argument as if they were equal, leading to a false equivalency. The overwhelming evidence points to a singular conclusion, such as numerous site layers in the Mariana Islands dated at 1500 BC or possibly older, based on extensive data sets that all are available in published form. Meanwhile, an outlying dissenting voice can propose an alternative opinion, such as dating closer to 1200 BC or perhaps even later, based on false or incomplete information that may or may not be disclosed for evaluation. Personally, I like to learn about dissenting voices, unorthodox ideas, and different perspectives that can make me aware of something that I would not have known otherwise. Sometimes these efforts can be instrumental in revolutionizing the way people think about an important issue. In any case, though, I would want to see the relevant and sufficient factual support for or against the new proposed idea or hypothesis. I hope that you enjoyed this video about debate and dispute in archaeology. Please share in the comment section about your thoughts and experiences. As always, thank you for watching. I will see you in the next video.